Hi, welcome to this session. Thank you for being here on time. This session is a little bit different from the first. It will start with the delivering of the awards, and I'll leave that to you.
Fantastic. And thank you, Nuno, who's a previous winner of one of these awards. So one of the really pleasurable parts of this meeting is to be able to give the annual awards that UFAW gives every year to people who've made exceptional progress in animal welfare science. And I'm delighted to be able to, first of all, give our Early Career Researcher of the Year award, which is for someone, as the name suggests, who's early on in their career, but already doing really impressive things in animal welfare science. And this year, that added to the tension. There we go. The award is being presented to Dr. Vicky Neville from the University of Bristol, or Bristol Veterinary School. Congratulations, Vicky. The nominations for this award were incredibly long. I won't try and summarize what everyone said about Vicky's work, but they all three of the nominators highlighted just what an exceptional researcher Vicky was after, I think it's 4 years from your PhD. So really incredibly early in her career. She's got this really diverse portfolio of really impactful research, basic research into animal emotions, looking at things like judgment bias, but also doing some really fantastic work at the sort of meta level with systematic reviews and meta-analysis, so synthesizing the evidence and testing the validity of a body of evidence, which is really important in animal welfare science and something that UFAW's incredibly keen to support. And she's worked in a diverse range of species and scenarios too, so a real diverse portfolio of research already. And I can see I'm already making her blush a little bit, so I won't go on. You can read more about Vicky's work and these awards at that link at the bottom there. And you can also nominate someone for this year's award if you know someone who's deserving. So without further ado, I'd like to present Vicky with her certificate and say a huge congratulations for an amazing body of work. Congratulations, Vicky. So thank you very much. Vicky will be talking about her research tomorrow, so you can also learn a lot more from Vicky. So do come back tomorrow for Vicky's talk. So having said that, I move on to the UFAW Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Animal Welfare Science, which this year goes to Professor Robert Elwood, who's Professor Emeritus in Animal Behaviour at Queen's University Belfast. And this award goes principally for Bob's incredibly innovative animal behaviour research, which has provided very strong evidence that decapod crustaceans are likely to be sentient and capable of perceiving pain. And the reason that Bob wins this award is because he's made these fundamental discoveries which have begun to be translated into actual change for animals, which is what I think most of us do animal welfare science for. So in the UK, we now have something called the Sentience Act, which recognises which species are considered sentient for the purpose of government. And now, after having extensively reviewed the evidence, that act includes decapod crustaceans, largely based on the work that Bob has done. There's a bit of work to be done to translate that into meaningful protection for decapods, but it's a really incredible first step to see those animals acknowledged as sentient after a detailed government review looked at the evidence from Bob and others. So that is exactly the kind of work that UFAW would like to support and acknowledge. So for that reason, I'm delighted to award Bob the UFAW Medal for Outstanding Contributions to Animal Welfare. Thank you very much. And Bob will be talking about his research, so you get to hear about it, which is absolutely fascinating. So Bob, once you've deposited your certificate, we can hear your talk.
Thank you very much. Go for it. Thank you very much. And thank you to you for the award. I take this as a huge honor, and it will increase the recognition that is given to decapods and the possibility that they might experience pain. So that's what I'm going to talk about, my research on crustaceans. That's packed up, but never mind. I can do that. It's not on. Right. I think the question of pain in crustaceans is important. First, because of the very severe treatments that are given to these animals in the food chain. We see cases of lobsters being boiled when they're alive. We see cases of crabs and lobsters having their claws bound during storage, possibly for many weeks. And these are mud crabs, common in the Far East, where they can be bound up completely for several weeks at a time. And my least favorite is these crab claws. And crab claws are sometimes harvested by, you catch the live crab out at sea, rip the claws off and throw the animal back in, where it is highly likely to die in the next hour or two from the injuries. But should it actually survive that, it will starve to death, highly likely. So that's the main reason, is the severity of treatment. The second reason is the unimaginably vast numbers of decapods that are used in the human food chain and exposed to each treatment. There are billions and billions of animals used every year in the human food chain. But first, to explain a little, I was asked to give a brief history of my academic development. It was suggested by Steve here and Ellen. So, not wishing to go back too far, there is absolutely no doubt that I was a delightful child. I look incredibly sweet. If slightly worried about having a photo taken, I'm being sheltered somewhat by my older sister, and I grew up in a family on the very north of London. We were right on the edge of the green belt, and I had a brother that was 6 years older than me. That was my closest sibling in age, and he was very keen on wildlife. And I used to tag along with him and his mates. Must have looked rather odd. He had a gang of mates when he was about 14, and I would be an 8-year-old tagging along. And we would go off out of London and just into the Greenbelt. There was a place called Scratch Woods that had everything there. There were frogs and toads and wide variety of birds and slow worms. And we had a great time. And he also taught me how to box. So he was a good brother from that point of view. But he left for Australia when I was about 11. So my attention then turned to a second David. David Attenborough was organizing his Zoo Quest series on TVs. He was showing series after series. And I was absolutely fascinated by this idea that you could go off into foreign lands and find animals, and it was just amazing. And I took to reading all the Zoo Quest books and others of that genre. There was Hans and Lottie Hats and Michaela Dennis and all sorts, Jacques Cousteau. That was my literature. Now, you would have thought that would have been good for my education, but in fact, it really wasn't. I was a complete failure at school. I wasn't interested. I paid no attention. And amidst a slightly acrimonious family dispute, I got a job a few days after I turned my 15th birthday and left school with no qualifications. So I was employed as an accounts clerk in a film advertising company. Those in Britain may know Pearl and Dean. And it was during that time that I was advised to get a few qualifications. My immediate boss said, you really should have something which you can put to a future employer. And then I moved on to cancer research as an animal technician, but that was for educational means. So I was advised to get these qualifications, and I got a couple, and then I thought I would do biology. I thought I quite liked biology from what I could remember from school. I'll take biology at a basic course called, in those days we had O levels, ordinary levels. And then I had my first break. My first real break was a few days before I was to start that course. I got a phone call to say it's been cancelled. And I was talked into taking an advanced zoology course. Now, I was full of trepidation. I thought this would be beyond my capabilities. But nevertheless, I was talked into it. I paid my money anyway, so and off I went. And I can remember that first lecture or lesson on zoology at advanced level. It was about sharks and how sharks, which are heavier than water, stay up and maneuver up in the water level. So I was just totally blown away. It was the first lesson that I'd ever had that I'd shown interest, and I really took to it. And I immediately signed up for an A-level botany course, which was held at the same place. And then the following year, having moved to cancer research, I took an A-level in chemistry, and I scraped up just enough O levels and A levels to get me into at university. And so I went to Reading University. I applied there. They seemed to be welcoming. And I went off to view the university for an open day. And I bumped into a young lecturer who showed me around and a group of others called Don Broom. Now, Don Broom is, of course, particularly famous in animal behavior and animal welfare, and is a previous recipient of this award. And he showed me around. He seemed like a very decent sort of guy. And so I got into Reading, and I took zoology with psychology, which was tailor-made really to get into animal behavior. And then I did a PhD on paternal and maternal behavior of the Mongolian gerbil and the development of the young. And I was supervised by Don Broom. This was prior to his major interest in animal welfare. His work was on chicks, and there was always a lovely interaction. On the few occasions he came into the lab or the animal room, he'd look into a cage and see the young pups, and he'd say, when did they hatch? So I then got a job in 1975 at Queen's University in Belfast, and as a lecturer in zoology. And now it was like being a child in a sweet shop. There were just so many things that you could research on, and no one told you what you had to research on. You could do anything, and there were just so many. And this is a small sample. There's about half the number of species. There's 19 on this slide, but I did count up to about 40 species, which I've done written papers on. And it was just so stimulating to be able to do that and to study behavior and a little bit of ecology. But there were two main species or groups that stood out. First of all, there were rodents. I used gerbils in Northern Ireland, and I switched also to mice. So I had both species being investigated. And the main question was, how do males switch from being quite aggressive towards young and treating them as food to get them into a paternal state by the time their first litter is born? And that was something that came up in my PhD thesis in the final few months. And I continued that work for about another 10, 15 years, at Queen's University. But the other species that was very stimulating, very important to me, were hermit crabs. I'd seen hermit crabs, first of all, when I was an undergraduate on a field course in Cornwall, and I was absolutely fascinated by those. And I started to do quite a lot of research on these, how they gathered information about resources, how they investigated shells in particular, all sorts of activities that were very, very interesting and commanded my attention. So it got to about 1994, where my work was on rodents and my hobby was on hermit crabs and some of these other things. And I decided to give up work and concentrate on my hobby, which seemed a sensible thing to do. And at that stage, my attention was being drawn to animal contests, how animals fight or compete for resources, and how they gather information about resources and about opponents, and how that information changes motivation and affects subsequent fight decisions. And that sort of was going quite well. I had one bit of success with the front cover of Nature. That's not photoshopped. That's so that was my line, and that's probably my most successful in some respects from the academic point of view of my approaches in animal behavior. So the question comes, how did I turn to looking at pain? And the idea came in my local pub in Northern Ireland. It's called the Dufferin Arms. I strongly recommend it. It's full of sensible people. And I was there one Friday evening, went for dinner in the downstairs restaurant and waiting at the bar for my table to be ready. And in walked Rick Stein. Now, some of you will know that Rick Stein is a very well-known TV seafood chef within the United Kingdom. And we chatted about our mutual interest in crustacea, and he's looked at me and simply said, his first words were really, do they feel pain? And I thought about that for a while. We discussed it for a while, couldn't give him an answer. So he was called to his table, I was called to my table, and that was the end of the conversation. But I eventually started to think about pain. And if you're thinking of pain, you have to start with an understanding of nociceptors. Nociceptors respond to various noxious, potentially damaging stimuli. They initiate reflex responses that remove the animal from the stimulus, and thus they avoid future tissue damage. Pain, however, at least in humans, occurs when nociceptors connect to the brain, not directly, but via other neurons. And they initiate an unpleasant experience that we think of as pain. And here's one of the questions that I asked myself when I was thinking about this early on in these studies. If the reflex that we get from a nociceptive reflex stops the damage, why have the pain? What is the benefit to the animal from experiencing something extremely unpleasant? Well, it seems that helps. The only sensible answer is that helps the animal to change its future behavior to ensure that it avoids that feeling in the future. So we can think of pain simply as a motivational state. So it enhances fitness by reducing future tissue damage. So nociceptors stop it in the immediate term, But if they have no awareness or no knowledge, they could go straight back and get wounded again. Whereas with pain, it's aversive and you avoid it in the future. Well, when I looked at claims on crustaceans to see whether there was any thoughts about the possibility that they might experience pain, it was an emphatic no. That was said that crustaceans respond to noxious stimuli by pure reflex response. They have no awareness, they have no pain, and so there is absolutely no need to be concerned about their welfare. But my approach then was, I was tackling a question that couldn't be answered, which is a foolish thing to do perhaps. But my approach was to ask really, are these nociceptive reflexes? It's sort of a roundabout way of getting information. I could tackle that. I couldn't ask the animal, do you experience pain? But I could ask, are there long-term changes in behavior and motivation that might enhance fitness, in which case they couldn't be reflexes? And I looked at short-term responses that might possibly be thought of as reflexes, but if I could show that they weren't, that they were showing to be a decision-making process, and I'll explain that more in a moment. And today I'm going to look at 5 behavioural criteria that might help discriminate pain from nociceptive reflex. I'm concentrating on behaviour here. Some other people, indeed like myself in earlier days, have looked at other indicators of pain, but the function of pain is to change behaviour. So it seems sensible to look at behaviour. And I'm going to start with avoidance learning. And as I said previously, it should enhance avoidance learning for long-term protection. And to give you a feel for the sort of experiments that we did in my lab, we used shore crabs, and shore crabs you can find on the shore under rocks, and they avoid bright light. They don't come out at low tide at bright light because they're subject to avian predation. So what I did was we did, I keep saying I instead of I really should say my students. What we did was to create an environment in the lab where it could be brightly lit. We had this brightly lit here, and we had 2 shelters here, dark shelters, which simulated rocks with crevices underneath. And if you place a crab in the middle here, you find that the crab quickly runs into one of those shelters. And we could choose whether or not it received an electric shock, which we provided by attaching wires with the insulation removed just at the end, wrapped around the hind legs where there's no calcareous exoskeleton, just at the point where you might successfully deliver a small electric shock. And as I say, the crab would quickly choose a shelter, and we decided by the toss of a coin whether that crab would be shocked or not in its first choice of shelter. We continued to shock the crab if it remained in that shelter every 5 seconds, but most of them got out fairly quickly. And if the shelter was chosen on a subsequent trial, it was shocked again. But if it chose the alternative shelter, it wasn't shocked. And we gave 10 trials to each crab on that basis. Just to skip to the main results, shore crabs showed swift avoidance learning. Just 2 experiences changed their behavior, so they avoided the shelter in which they received shock. This is not predicted by nociceptive reflex. And the data we found in general, and there are other data from the experiment, the data are consistent with the idea of pain. And I like using that phrase I'm not saying it proves pain. I'm simply saying it's consistent with the idea of pain. So let's move on to motivational trade-offs, and I'll try to explain what I mean by a trade-off. If you look at zebra forage on dry African plains, they build up a huge deficit of water, and they eventually come to a pool and try to get some water, and they very reliably approach and drink. But you can show that that's not a reflex reaction, because sometimes they approach but don't actually get to the water. And here we have the zebra, and their choice of behavior is being determined partly by the water and partly by the presence of a predator. So they're making a decision here not to drink in order to avoid predation. And so that's what I mean by a trade-off. There is a trade-off in all behavioral decisions, so it cannot be a reflex. So I've given this talk many, many times, but I've never included this experiment, which was in fact discovered lurking in a thesis until quite recently. But here we have something similar to that situation. We have shore crabs, and there was just one shelter available, but the enclosure either had dull light or bright light. That is, we varied the intensity of the external light. And when it went into the shelter, we varied what happened. Some didn't receive a shock, some received a very mild shock, and some received a somewhat less mild shock. What you can see here is that the decision, and this is in this case, we use 20 trials, and this is the last 5 trials, and it's whether they go into the shelter or not. And the decision about going into the shelter is influenced both by the light level, and by the shock level. That is, they are more likely to go in if it's bright light and they don't receive a shock. So there's a trade-off between avoiding light and avoiding shock. It is not a reflex reaction, it is a behavioral decision. We can look at that in hermit crabs. We can have crabs offered shells which are wired up so that they can be shocked within the shell on their abdomen. This is what the crab looks like in a wired up shell. It can still walk around in a glass shell. That's there to illustrate that this is where they get the shock on the naked abdomen, which is within the shell. So if you shock crabs within their shell, they sometimes get out of the shell, particularly if it's a high level shock. And the question is that a reflex? It's quite a rapid behavior, so it could easily be a reflex. What we did, mimicking the zebra example, was to have the crabs, when they're being shocked, either in water where there's a predator odor, the odor of a non-predator, these are mussels, or just plain seawater. And this is the number of animals, or the percentage of animals which got out of their shell when there was a predator present. That's 41%, and it was 80% for a non-predator, and 95% when it was seawater. So getting out of the shell is not a reflex. There's a trade-off between avoiding a predator and avoiding the shock. It's a decision. And a third example, because I like trade-offs, hermit crabs on the shores of Northern Ireland occur mainly in these 2 species of shell, Littorina and Gibula, and they really like these Littorina shells. They much prefer these Littorina shells, and they really aren't keen on those. And just to illustrate that, this is a photo here of a crab in the Gibula shell, and it's approaching this other crab, and it's going to fight it for its shell. It's going to try and get the preferred species of shell. So we shot some crabs that were in gibular shells. We shot other crabs that were in littorina shells, and they were more likely to get out of the shell if it was the less preferred species. That is, they were trading off avoiding shock and maintaining a good shell. So here we have a third example where it cannot be a reflex, it is a behavioural decision. In this experiment, that last example was part of a larger experiment where in fact we offered shocks to some animals but did not offer shocks to others. If they didn't get out of the shell, and we only offered low-level shocks, if they didn't get out of the shell, and we didn't really want them to get out of the shell, because we were only going to use those that did not get out of the shell. If they didn't get out of the shell, we offered them a new empty shell. And we looked to see whether the behavior towards that new empty shell was influenced by receiving a shock or not. Well, it did, quite dramatically. Those that were shocked were more likely to approach the new shell, and they were more likely to move into the new shell. Shocked crabs in the open bars showed a shorter latency to contact the new shell than those that had not been shocked. So these were more motivated to get to the shell. And when hermit crabs encounter an empty shell, they invariably put their chilipeds into the aperture of the shell. They measure the size of the shell, ensure that it's empty and available. And if you look at how these crabs differ, those that were shocked previously use far fewer chiliped probes in investigation prior to moving in compared to those that had not been shocked. So it's quite clear that the motivation of these crabs have been dramatically changed with respect to shells. And these crabs, these shocked crabs, are acting as if they are in very poor shells. It fits with a whole range of other data that we've done over the years. They now devalue that shell having received a shock. And that effect lasts up to 24 hours. That's the longest we did the experiment between giving the shock and presenting the shell. You still see that difference, 24 hours. So that cannot be a reflex. So the small shock has dramatically changed the motivation of the crab, and that's a very long-term change in motivation. Let's move on to prolonged directed rubbing. I find this quite a persuasive feature because, you know, if I get hurt, it doesn't change my behavior towards shells and things, but I do rub. I hold, if I've hit my finger with a hammer, I would invariably hold my finger and rub it and direct attention to the particular finger that's been damaged. So do we see this in crustaceans? This was the first experiment that we did in this series of studies. We use glass prawns, which have very long antennae, and we randomly selected one antenna, and that antenna received two treatments, a two-stage experiment. First of all, we brushed the antenna either with seawater or with a local anesthetic. We put the animal back in the water for 5 minutes, then took it out, and we gave a second treatment, which was one group got water, one group got sodium hydroxide, third group got acetic acid, and a fourth group were pinched with forceps on the same antenna. Now I'm going to just build up these results bit by bit because they're a bit too complicated to show them at one go. If we look at those animals that were first treated with water and then they had these second treatments, this is the ones that got a second treatment of water. They don't groom their antenna. These are the chemical treatments. They show prolonged grooming, and those that are pinched with forceps show a little bit of grooming, but it's not dramatic. It was significant, I believe. And not only do they groom, and they groom by having their little pincers, and they get hold of the antenna. They just pull the antenna repeatedly through pincers, but they also rub the antenna against the side of the tank, and that shows pretty much the same result. So noxious stimuli, noxious chemicals cause grooming, and it's directed to that antenna. It's not a generalized grooming response. This is the results for the alternative antenna that was not treated. So there's some sort of awareness or ability to localize the source of the stimulus. And then if we look at what happens if they were pre-treated with a local anesthetic, compare these two groups, pre-treatment with a local anesthetic significantly reduces the amount of grooming and also rubbing against the side of the tank. It struck me that that prolonged grooming in a fairly complex manner and rubbing against the side of the tank didn't ring true about being a reflex. So I think these data are consistent with the idea of pain. Another study published rather recently involved using acetic acid again, this time with shore crabs, and this time we injected the acetic acid into a hind leg at a distal joint. And we injected there either 0%, that is just water, or 0.25, 0.5, or 1% acetic acid, and we simply observed what the crab did in the enclosure. Those that received acetic acid held their leg, held that specific leg up off the substrate and almost vertically up in the water column. They also showed rubbing of that particular leg with adjacent legs. So very prolonged rubbing. And finally, we saw that a number of crabs showed autotomy of the injected leg. Now, we saw these other two activities irrespective of acetic acid, as long as it was acetic acid going in, but it was only the higher concentrations that induced autotomy of that appendage. And the autotomy often came after these other activities that were directed, this rubbing that we see and this strange posture. And because of that, we hypothesized that autotomy might be at least partly induced by pain. It fits with that idea that pain might be involved in that behavior. And autotomy is a natural behavior in these animals, and it causes a limb to be cast off at a specific pain at a proximal joint where the leg joins the body, and there's little injury involved in that form of shedding a leg. So we see grooming, rubbing, autotomy. We also see guarding of wounds in edible crabs that we've looked at. And these directed activities, they're directed at the specific location. They are consistent with the idea of pain. So finally then, I'm going to look at anxiety. And these are data from an experiment on trade-offs that I showed before, where there are different voltages given to shock animals if they go into a shelter. But this is looking at the behavior of the crab as it's making the decision whether or not to go into the shelter, but it's only the crabs that actually moved into the shelter. So all these crabs went into the shelter. This is the latency to enter the shelter. And I'd seen indications of this in a previous experiment, that crabs appear to become hesitant about moving into a shelter where they've received a shock, and these have received a shock and these haven't. So it's indicative of that, which would fit with the idea of anxiety. But if you look also at other things that the animals are doing, some animals, rather than moving straight into the shelter, instead sort of back up against the side of the tank, particularly into a corner, and push into that until they have decided that this, perhaps anthropomorphically, this corner isn't working for me, I'm going to go into the shelter. But it's only those animals that have received shocks show that behavior. Those that don't receive shock do not show this behavior. So they're trying to select a different activity, and it's only after that isn't working that they go into the shelter. So this agrees with general ideas about anxiety. So what are my conclusions? The data go beyond nociceptive reflex. None of these things that I've shown can be explained in any reasonable way by a reflex response. There are long-term motivational changes after exposure to noxious stimuli, and the behavioural data are consistent with the idea of pain. There's an awareness of the site of the injury. Hermit crabs that leave shells and shore crabs that leave dark shelters are giving up valuable resources in order to avoid the stimulus. That is, they are paying to avoid the shock. There are indications of anxiety. In other experiments, there are indications of increased attention to danger. However, whilst all these data are consistent with the criteria of pain, that is not the same as proving pain. However, the accumulation of evidence suggests that we cannot dismiss the idea of pain in these animals. For that reason, we should give these animals the benefit of the doubt, known as the precautionary principle. They should be treated with care in experiments and should be slaughtered in a humane manner. Well, when the first of these studies came, that was the one of the glass prawn, and then others came on. There was a huge media attention. I was really, really taken aback. And I was quite amazed that the day of the journal gave out a press release that the Daily Mail of all newspapers, I know those from the UK will have their own opinion about the Daily Mail, had a paragraph about this experiment. I thought, oh, that's very interesting. Most of the other newspapers had it as well. But the following day, there was a 2-page spread on that experiment. 2 entire pages were devoted to pain in crustacean. There was huge attention from the BBC, interviews, World Service, radio interviews. And not that long after, an organization called Crustacean Compassion started up to promote crustacean welfare. I didn't join that organization, so I wanted to retain my independence as a scientist. And And then there were elements of changes in attitude amongst important bodies. The British Veterinary Association and the RSPCA both changed their policy with regards to crustaceans. Switzerland changed the law and banned the boiling of live lobsters, and the government, the UK government, commissioned a report on both decapods and cephalopods on whether they might experience pain, and that report concluded that yes, they did, and or at least that it was very likely that they did, and the UK government changed the law and declared these animals as sentient. So to wrap up, I've had many students going through the lab, working on pain in crustacea, and I'd like to thank those for putting up with me. I'd like to thank also Don Broom for inspiration in animal behaviour and careful guidance when I was much younger. We're still great friends and get on well. I'd like to thank Rick Stein for coming to the pub that night and posing a question. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and to UFAW for this very generous award. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you also for almost keeping to time. But fortunately, Hugh allowed us some leeway. So if there's a short question, an even shorter answer in the audience. Oh, one in the back, please.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm Sarah from Paws International. I just have a question regarding your last comment with the law change in the UK regarding these animals as sentient beings. I just saw here a paragraph that they have saying that the practices in the industry will not be changed based on this law. Has anything, because I know this is from 2021, has anything changed in the meantime?
Yes and no. The government haven't changed. The government haven't changed anything specifically as yet. What is likely to happen is that they will change the way that animals are used in scientific experimentation. And by doing so, help to ameliorate the treatment given to crustaceans, and that may involve a few thousand animals. But they are very reluctant to change anything about the commercial interest, which involves billions of animals. So they're not even scratching the problem, but they will say, but we've dealt with it. But it has changed public attitude, and public attitude counts. And there is more and more demand for high welfare, ethically treated food products. And now there are changes in the food industry driven by supermarkets, and that is moving forward. And so I believe that there will be meaningful change in the future.
Thank you so much, Mark. Unfortunately, we do not have time for more questions, but we have 3 excellent short talks. So I would like to welcome first Aileen MacLellan. You know the drill, you only have 3 minutes. By 3 minutes, I will show you the red card. If you go past like 30 seconds, I will throw you the red card. And more than that, I'll activate the trap door that will open under your feet. Other than that, good luck.
Severe
Thank you.
consequences. Okay, so yes, I'm Aileen MacLellan, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow with the Canadian Council on Animal Care. So as a disclaimer, the views from my presentation today are my own, because I'll be talking about work from a study that I ran during my PhD with Dr. Georgia Mason, aiming to validate the use of live home cage behavioral observations in mice as a tool for welfare assessment. So live or in-person behavioral observations are an excellent practical and non-invasive tool for both research data collection and for welfare assessment during animal care. And there's growing recognition for the value of this approach. For instance, in Canada, our national oversight body, the Canadian Council on Animal Care, now requires use of behavioral indicators during regular welfare assessment. But in some cases, the presence of an observer can change the behavior of the animals that we're trying to assess. This is a phenomenon called observer effects, and it's something that's been minimally investigated in laboratory animals, but has potential implications for the value of this method for data collection. So here, we ask the question, does the mere presence of an observer during observations change the behavior of lab mice that we're assessing? Our goal was to assess the validity of this method. In the study we ran, we had 48 female mice housed in 16 conventional cages, and the cages were video recorded for 4 hours during the dark active phase on 6 consecutive days. Each day was randomly assigned to either an observer present treatment, where one of 2 female observers would simulate live scan sampling while the cages were being filmed, or an observer absent treatment where no humans were present in the room while the cages were filmed. And what we found was that there was no observer effects detected across the board, so good news. There was no differences in behavior on days where an observer was present, shown with green bars here, or absent, shown with the light green bars. And this held true for total activity levels, levels of stereotypic behavior, levels of inactive but awake behavior, and aggression. So activity and 3 widely used welfare indicators were not impacted by the presence of an observer. What does this mean? So together, these results provide evidence for the validity of behavioral observations for both research and for welfare assessments. But when we consider the generalizability of these findings, it's promising that we see consistent results across 2 observers and 3 strains of mice. However, further replication is now needed to confirm the validity of this method in other contexts, and also to better understand risk factors and mitigation strategies for observer effects. So with that, I'll say thank you to UFAW for organizing this meeting, and please ask me any questions you have either later now or come by the poster.
Thank you. That was absolutely perfect. Just a quick reminder that we will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. So next up is Justyna Hinchcliffe. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Yes, okay, thank you. Presenting the 3H initiative, right up my alley.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for letting me give a chance to give the very short talk about our 3Hs initiative. So the lead person who started the 3Hs initiative was Professor Emma Robinson. She's a PI in my group. There's a few other creators or co-creators of the 3Hs initiative, apart from obviously myself. There's also Dr. Megan Jackson, Julia Bartlett, and Jen Davis. They all contributed the research to validate our new refined methods. So what actually is 3Hs initiative? Not sure if you probably have heard, because we're trying to reach the most institutions, organizations, pharma companies, and all animal care staff organizations as well. When we launched officially our website end of March, we're trying to disseminate our methods we've developed over the years. So 3Hs initiative is a comprehensive framework that try to aim to refine the lifetime experience of animals in animal facilities, but also contribute to reduction of cumulative suffering they can experience during their lifetime in an animal facility. So 3Hs obviously stands for housing, handling, and habituation. And the 3Hs very nicely fits with the concept of the 3 Rs, because we tapping into the refinement part of the 3 Rs. So we know that whilst refinement of each individual procedure can have a very large impact on animals' experience during and after the procedures. However, we know the majority of animal a majority of our live animals spend in their home cage. So we take a slightly different approach. Rather than focusing on refining each individual procedure, we're trying to look at the entire lifespan of an animal and also the non-regulated procedure, like all the handling protocols, husbandry procedures, and how animals are housed. And obviously the talk is very short. I can't list all the procedures we refined. So please go to our website. It's all open access. You can find all the videos, photos, all the relevant information for mice and rats. You can also access our protocols or guidance documents about all our procedures. So we also know, that's a few examples on the photos of our refinement methods and techniques. So we all know that animals have to be daily checked, health checked, obviously. They're also undergoing lots of procedures during their lifetime. And how we can manage those procedures and those daily experiences to improve their animal welfare, to make positive impact, and to let them express all naturalistic behavior, but also how can we manage that and try to achieve our scientific objectives and meet our scientific needs. So there are a few opportunities how we can refine that. For example, we can reduce stress associated with the handling. We can reduce the use of physical restraint. We know most of the substrate administration, we use scruff dosing animals or rats. So we refined the method. We developed a very low restraint method of IP and subcutaneous injections. Also, instead of tail scruffing, we arm scruffing mice, so they kind of less averse to that once they're well habituated. We also use refined habituation and I'll start to speak faster. Refine the gradual habituation. Just threw me out of that. Sorry. Refine our habituation protocols, and especially when they are repeated on multiple occasions. But also we can enhance housing enrichment by using ball pit and playpens, for example, for rats, but also refining and adding enrichment to the mice housing. And also, all these methods are very well validated and objectively measured by different behavioral molecular observations by our group. So it's the methods are definitely working, not because our group trying to say they work very well, but they've actually been validated and they can be very well implemented. And if you'd like to find out more about the methods, please speak to me in a coffee break. I've got also a poster, and thank you.
Thank you, Justyna. And now for something completely different, Julia Miller, on the impact of owner support strategies on the behavioral dogs facing a novel stimulus.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'm happy to share with you the results of our study on the impact of owner support strategies on the behavior of dogs facing a novel stimulus. At the background for our study was the fact that owners can choose different strategies to support their dogs in the presence of a potential stressor. And these common strategies include providing treats, using calming, verbal communication, and or petting, or some owners may try to encourage the dogs by approaching the object themselves. So our study aimed to evaluate the impact of these different support strategies of the dog's behavior in the presence of a stressor. So here you can see the basic design of our experiment. So of course we had a habituation phase, and then we had two phases where we turned on a remotely controlled car placed in a plastic tub. And in the interaction phase, our 48 participants were assigned to 4 conditions. So here we have the control condition when the owner was basically doing nothing. The treats condition, where the owner was providing a treat every 5 seconds after we turned on the car. Then we had the approach condition when the owner approached the box, was pointing at the box and talking to the dog. And the calming condition where the owner remained sitting on the chair, was allowed to talk to the dog and if approached. And then after a break, we had a passive phase where we turned on the car again, but this time all the owners remained passive. So for the analysis, we evaluated the stress level on a 4-point scale from no stress to high stress. And we also used partial interval procedure to measure affiliative behaviors and object-directed behaviors. And regarding the stress levels, we saw that the dogs in the treats group, they were scored as the least stressed for both the interaction and the passive phase. However, it reached statistical significance only in the interaction phase and only when compared to the approach group. And I'm showing also some results from the affiliative behavior coding and object-directed behaviors only for the interaction phase, because in the passive phase, we saw no differences across conditions. But in the interaction phase, dogs in the control group, they gazed at the owners less frequently than dogs from all the other groups. And they also spent less time in the proximity of their owners when compared to the treats group. On the other hand, dogs in the approach group, they spent more time in the proximity of the car, of the object, than dogs in the control and treats group. And we also saw a positive, though weak, correlation between stress levels and car proximity. So we concluded that the passive owner behavior in the presence of a stressor may discourage the dogs from looking for support and engaging in communication with their owners. We think also that dogs may choose to follow the owners if the owner approaches the stressor despite their unwillingness to approach the object themselves. In our study, treats appeared to be more salient than the stressor. However, we need more research to evaluate the long-term effects of different support techniques on dogs. Thank you for listening.
We have the opportunity to ask questions. So if Justyna and Aileen speaks to
Okay, may I? Okay, so I'll start because I have the mic. My question is for Aileen. When I saw the title of your talk, I thought that the validation would be about the capacity for the human capacity to do direct observations. It was very nice that you reminded me that the presence of the observer is also an issue. But as someone who works with lab mice, I find it quite challenging to do things live with the animals as compared to recording. So I wonder if you could comment on that aspect.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point. There's certainly pros and cons to both approaches. One of the major advantages with live observations relative to video, for example, is convenience and ability to see the entire cage, sort of avoiding missing data. So even just for that experiment, the setup of the cameras every single day and the transferring videos just takes a lot of time. There's sort of room for error and loss. And then in scoring the videos, especially we film our mice under red light during their dark active phase. So in person, it's so much easier to catch details about just being able to lean to the side and say, okay, that mouse is sleeping, their eyes are closed. But there absolutely are pros and cons. Having video means that you can pause and look at some of these more rare interactions. So yeah, certainly pros and cons to both, but especially many people do rely on live observations. So reassuring that in this instance, it was no observer effects.
Thank you. Sorry, my question's for Aileen as well, if that's okay. You're allowed. Yeah, I can ask at the poster.
Yeah, okay. Do we have one for Julie? Yeah.
My question's for Julia. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate more on your scores for stress for the dogs.
Yes. Yeah, I was kind of
Perfect. Thank you.
prepared for this question because we this was our second study with a similar design. And in the first study, we used ethogram coding. So we coded all the body postures associated with stress and vocalization and everything. But actually, our inter-observer reliability was quite poor with the ethogram coding. So we did both for both of the studies, but now I didn't have really time to evaluate both, so to explain both approaches. So we did this, just like we prepared a scale based on our first experiment. We use and we have just our team is so we have dog behaviorists in our team and behavioral analysts, and this is what we prepared all together. And we also did this ethogram coding with every single behavior body posture, like tail down. But this was a disaster with the tail down. Is it down because it's hanging down, or is it forcefully down? So so we had much more problems with this reliability, but this is basically the scale we have used.
Thank you. Any question for Justyna? If not, I'll take the advantage of having a mic here. Okay, so you mentioned that all these methods are validated as matter for animal welfare. And now that you have that information, what are you doing to spread the good word? Are you doing workshops, courses? Are you
Yes.
reaching out to people?
Yeah, we've had a webinar and it's recorded. It's on our website, so people can go back and look at all the data and all the story, how when we develop and what exactly we developed. But also, yeah, we've got all the information there people can go and find. And even if you're a very young scientist or young animal care technician, you can go and learn a lot of new things. We also got a CPD course on the website, so people can go sign up, go through it and get a certificate at the end, so you can add to your professional development. And we've had already about, I think, 1,000 people done the CPD course from 38 countries. So it's definitely been quite taken up, the whole idea of improving wealth, and people know how important that is. And not only obviously universities, also pharma companies. We had also Charles River also been interested to improve the handling protocols and set up the playpens, for example, for rats. So it's definitely, yeah, it's very popular at the moment, and people definitely want to learn a bit more. And obviously, we're invited to talks, and we're trying to disseminate at various conferences as well.
Okay,
For
brilliant.
reach far and wide.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So I would like again to thank all. We had a brilliant session, and I wouldn't want to be the one keeping you from refreshments. So let's go.